We tend to focus more on Christmas, the birth of Christ. In Eastern Orthodox Christianity and in many Latin American countries, Epiphany is observed as the more important day, or the equally important day. In many Latin cultures, both in the countries where Spanish or Portuguese is spoken, and also where people are living in other countries. This is the day when gifts are exchanged, not Christmas Day. And the children leave out straw for the camels. And it's kind of a bigger deal than Christmas is. But they're really bookends to the events surrounding the birth of Christ. And Epiphany is a word that just means manifestation or revelation or even insight. A moment when we see things differently from that moment on. When something either that we've been seeing for a long time appears to us in a new light, or when we see something that's startlingly, really, genuinely new. An epiphany is not just a religion word. People use it in literary terms. People use it to describe when they've had something happen to them that changes everything, even though in some ways nothing may look different to others. And that's what this event is. The Epiphany, why it's celebrated so strongly, particularly among Eastern Orthodox Christians, is that Jesus, who was thought to be part of the Hebrew lineage only, is recognized by people outside of his tradition and culture as some new appearance of God, of some new manifestation of deity. And it cuts across lines of culture and religion and politics and geography. Up until that time, in the evolution of world religions, most people identified their religion with their nation, with their culture, with their language. Christianity becomes, in a marriage of politics with the Roman Empire, something that has had a negative impact, but also a positive side. It becomes a religion for everyone. Religion is no longer seen as belonging just to one people, one culture, one language, one tradition. Religion is seen as something that crosses borders and is greater and transcends all of those other things. And that's a lot for a little baby in a manger to bear. But that is the theological import of Epiphany. And we're going to be looking at Epiphany as a season, as we do in the United Church of Christ and other Christian faiths, for the month of January, with a particular lens on migration. There's a lot of ways to read this story, but I felt, and I felt this not only in my work here in this congregation, but in talking with other ministers, that migration and immigration is such an important issue right now that it would be important to focus time on it, just to make sure that we're looking at some of the same information and on the same page. Migration simply means movement and is recognized by the United Nations and by many countries as a natural human right. At any given time, 3% of the world's population is in migration, in motion, in movement. And this month I want us to think about how migration is also, it's political, it's geographical, it's also spiritual too. It really just means movement. And in spiritual terms, movement is life, motion is life. Stasis or paralysis is death. And that's a lot to put on the baby story too, but I'd like us to be open to this notion that the metaphor and the reality of migration can speak to us in our personal lives as well as in our life as a church. Now, one thing that is true in the history of the Congregational Church of the Peninsula is that there's been a kind of organic recognition and movement toward that's just in a way that's very natural to us through philanthropy, generosity, financial giving, and giving of time to this issue of migration and immigration as it's taking place in this moment. I figured that it was a good time for us to hear from the Circle of Care that administers a $50,000 fund on our behalf to provide relief to people who are experiencing trauma because of what's happening in our immigration policies in this area. We also, through our investment giving, through our investment funds, gave over $20,000 this year in the Bay Area to organizations that are also providing immigrant and migrant relief. And then through our general giving, we also have given some sums. And through another one of our funds, the Todd Gothold Fund, we have provided relief for people in our community. The total sum is more than 10% of our budget. And it comes from different sources. But some people say that when you look at a church's budget or its spending, it's a picture in concrete terms of what's important to it, of its mission. And it is certainly true that this has evoked greater generosity from our congregation, which I think has a history of generosity, than any other single issue with this amount of funds in the past. And I don't say this to sound prideful, but we are really a trendsetter in our United Church of Christ congregations in Northern California in expending this kind of generosity. I also want to acknowledge with gratitude that a number of people in the church have been doing significant volunteer work through accompanying people to court or by giving gifts like we did at Christmas time. So their volunteer time with Know Your Rights trainings and things like that represents, it's a wave. It means something. And one of the wonderful things about being a congregation in the United Church of Christ is that we actually care about what's happening in the world. It's one of our trademarks. It's our brand, if you will. We are the church that speaks about it, looks at it, talks about it, engages it. Some churches have a different approach, but it is true of the UCC. And immigration advocacy, immigration reform, immigration justice are all an important dimension of United Church of Christ affiliation. It has its roots in this story, I think, or one of its principal roots in this story. So that's what I want to look at least this morning, as we explore over the next 4 weeks this notion that love has no borders. It's a theme that comes to us from the United Church of Christ, and we'll be looking at different words associated with it each week. Love has no borders. God has no borders. Beloved community has no borders. Jesus has no borders. But this morning I want to look at love and how it's depicted in this story, which we associate with the Epiphany. So I grew up in going to church school for full-time school until I was in 9th grade. So we learned things that other people didn't necessarily learn. And I was joking with Rebecca earlier, who grew up in a Protestant evangelical Christian home where the Bible alone was the only thing that guided what they knew or what they talked about in terms of Christianity. But in parochial school, we had other sources. It wasn't until I got to college that I found out there were other books written at the time of Jesus, one called the Proto-Evangelion of James, who knew, and it gives names to the Magi: Gaspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. I'm not saying it's true. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying that people have identified names with these. And this story has these figures that we call magi, or sages, wise people, astrologers, people who followed the stars and found meaning in them. In the original story, in the text from Matthew, there's no number associated with them, no names, no gender. In fact, the language is one that could be male or female. It's a generic word. And it says that in the time of Herod the king, this is always a clue when there's a time associated with a story, that reminds us that our faith takes place in the unfolding of the news around us. It's particular. It's not metaphysical, it's physical. It's embedded in what's happening. At the time of Herod the king, Magi, wise ones, came from the east, and they were seeking the one who was born to be the leader of the people of Israel. That's how they described it. So this is the first of two migration stories in this passage. The first one is of the Magi, who come from the east, from another culture, from another place, in order to find revelation. Their migration is one that causes them to leave what is home, what is familiar to them, and gives them the courage to cross boundaries and to cross borders in order to seek something spiritually that somehow isn't satisfying to them or sufficiently meaningful to them in their homeland where they came from. It causes them to look abroad, to look outside, to look across borders. And they love their spiritual lives so much that they're willing to take this risk and go on an adventure in order to seek divine revelation. No journey is without politics, though. Some commentators have said that because they came from Persia, part of the outward parts of the Roman Empire, they were perhaps hoping that what they would find when they got to Jerusalem would be a leader that would help liberate them from the oppressive arm of the Roman Empire. We don't know what they were seeking exactly, but it is a story of spiritual migration, leaving where we come from in order to find something new. They encounter Herod, who becomes very interested in this. Herod is a tyrant, a despot, one who was known to even kill his own children if they disputed with him. People were afraid of him, afraid to contradict him, and he becomes very interested in what he sees as a potential rival. Because they're outsiders, they're able to see something that he cannot see and that others are afraid to tell him about for fear of his anger and his retribution. They continue on their journey, and then we see the entrance to the other migration story that's in here. They see Jesus, Mary, and Joseph in unusual circumstance. They are a dislocated family already away from their hometown. They present them with gifts that are symbolic: gold, frankincense, myrrh, the usual things you bring to a baby shower. And they are symbolic. The gold represents royalty. The frankincense, worship, because they used incense in the worship in the temples at that time. And myrrh, which is perhaps the weirdest gift, a reminder of mortality. It's used as an embalming substance. So that one was probably raised an eyebrow or two. But they were meant to say, look, something is happening here that is bigger than what it looks like. And as spiritual migrants, they're able to see it. And these migrants, these spiritual migrants, also tip off Joseph, Mary, and Joseph to leave and to seek safety in another land, because where they are is no longer safe. Herod is intent upon destroying them. And as the story goes on, we're told that Herod does in fact seek for them, but because they had been warned, they sought refuge in Egypt, a different place, a different language, a different culture, a different religion, though we are told that there were other refugees from Palestine, Israel, living in Egypt at the time. So they stole away by night at great risk in order to find not just a better life, but personal safety. That's the second migration story here. people seeking a better life, people seeking safety because where they live isn't safe. And I want to lift up those two examples for us as we go through this month and look at different aspects of migration, because they are two kinds of migration that are currently taking place. Some may feel more comfortable or familiar to us. Some we're affected by. Some people in this room, I will tell you, have been affected by the need for political migration for safety. People are coming to the United States at great personal risk. People are crossing from Africa into Europe at great personal risk and sometimes huge loss of life in order to find safety because where they live is no longer safe. These stories are embedded in our history, but they speak to us in the present. Spiritual migration, political migration. Just as those spiritual migrants brought gifts, I invite us to be open to the ways that migrants and people who are immigrating also bring gifts. You know, I remember in my early years of activism in the church, people would refer to me and people like me as the church dividing issue of homosexuality. And that's what they called it, a church dividing issue. And all we would ever say at the time was, we are not a church dividing issue. We are a gift, and we bring gifts to you if you'll be open to having us among you. And that was one way I identified with this migration. If we can see people who are in migration right now as bringing gifts and not as a social problem to be solved, it might change how we perceive, approach, and receive them. Not with, stay where you are, but with, how can I help you? How can I assist you? How can I accompany you in this journey so that we can receive their gifts? It's not transactional only. It is also, I think, the right thing to do. But migration is the lens through which I think we can see this. I want to say one more thing about the United Church of Christ, our denomination, the group that we belong to and have belonged to since the end of the 1950s when it came into being. It is a migration destination church. How many of us here, just by show of hands, are cradle congregationalists? Can we say to you, thank you? By cradle, I mean you were born into the congregational church. Thank you for being part of a tradition and keeping the lights on and keeping it open so that the rest of us could find a refuge here. Most people who go to the United Church of Christ now, the Congregationalist Church, were not born in the Congregational Church. We migrated from another church in order to be here. Some of us come from secular backgrounds and found here an amicable place because of all the latitude that we give people to explore spiritually that's different from how we grew up or where we came from. We don't ask, what do you believe? But we ask, do you wish to join our journey? That's how we accompany migrants, spiritual migrants. In many of the churches I've served, I've seen this phenomenon. In the MCC church, which is now gradually becoming the UCC, the one in San Francisco, and no one was from there. We gathered from people from across the country and across the world who came there because they were gay, and were reinventing a church in the 1980s and 90s where we could have our own self-determined spirituality. We used to joke that MCC stood for Midwestern Community Church because it did feel a little bit like that at times, right in the center of San Francisco. The church I served in Dallas, Cathedral of Hope, one of the largest churches in the United Church of Christ, the largest LGBT church in the world, literally, still, came to understand itself as a migrant church in solidarity with immigrants. They have two congregations worshiping as one, the Cathedral of Hope and Catedral de la Esperanza, the Spanish language congregation, which was itself composed of people from 30 different Spanish-speaking countries. And this was this was 10 years ago now that I was there. And at that time, people were disappearing regularly from Texas because of immigration crackdowns, some of whom had families who had been in Texas for generations, because Texas used to be Mexico. And they came to understand themselves as a migration destination church. Also, in the Texas context, this is true almost still, I think. I talk to people there. We have a group of women who come to our Tuesday book group from Tyler, Texas, each week online. It's not a question of where do you go to church when you meet people. They always say to you, what church do you go to? And that's how they introduce themselves to you. And you better have an answer. So having a church where they could be welcome is what they found in the MCC and then in the United Church of Christ. A church I served, the Congregational Church in Needham, Massachusetts. In the early part of the 2000s, there was a Catholic church in town and the Congregational Church. The Congregational Church was frankly waning a little bit in participation. It had been there for a couple hundred years. But there was a terrible scandal that you've perhaps heard about, and it wasn't just in Boston, but in terms of how the Roman Catholic Church handled priests who were abusing children, and it happened in that town. And at that time, a number, and I mean a lot of people, came over from the Catholic Church and joined the Congregational Church and gave it new life and new hope because they couldn't be in a church anymore that ignored the scandals that were going on. People find a home in the United Church of Christ that they haven't been able to find other places. It doesn't make us better than others, but it is one of our gifts to be a migration destination church. When I was in Duluth at the Peace United Church there, this is what diversity was in Duluth. The Danish Lutherans, the Swedish Lutherans, the Norwegian Lutherans, the Finnish Lutherans, the German Lutherans. They each had their own church, and some of them had more than one. The Finnish had two kind, the apostolics, as they called themselves, and the other kind. But one thing they had in common was if they got divorced, they couldn't be remarried in the Lutheran church. And that's how they found their way to Peace Church. It became the church that was known proudly as the place where you can have a second lease on life, where you can bring your whole family without scandal, but with welcome. They like to call themselves the largest progressive church in northern Minnesota, and they didn't have any competition for that. No one said, no, we are that. It really stood for something there. I know it doesn't stand out so much on the landscape here, but I want to lift up that this is one of our spiritual gifts here. And I hope that we will continue to be a church that really welcomes people and asks the question, fellow traveler, not what do you believe, but do you want to join us? And one last thing I'll say is I want to invite us to be more of a migration church in the upcoming year. I was so proud. I was in Palm Springs last week watching our church online, watching this church's band online playing at the Congregational Church of San Mateo. And I have to say, you were a big hit. And that's all that the other pastors have talked about with me. It's like, the music at your church is so cool. They loved the band. And they were able to experience it because we took a risk and joined together. We traveled, just as we've traveled to San Carlos Church. And this year I want to ask us on 5th Sundays of the month and on holiday weekend Sundays, we'll print out the list far in advance, to either be willing to continue to travel or to receive visitors here at our church on those Sundays. There is revelation in migration. There's revelation in the journey. And today I invite you to continue to journey together and to let love be our guiding star. Amen.